Welcome. We're glad you found this recorded presentation by the Knox County Master Gardeners. We are a volunteer community service group affiliated with the University of Tennessee, as well as Tennessee State University and their cooperative extension programs. The mission of the Knox County Master Gardener program is to educate and serve the community using research-based information on best practices in horticulture, environmental stewardship, and integrated pest management. One of the ways we educate is through our Speakers Bureau.
Hey guys, I'm Erin Sapp.
And I'm Burnette.
We are Knox County Master Gardeners, and today we are sharing part 2 of our series on fungi. This talk will focus on mushroom cultivation. Please see part 1, Roots of Theory, for more general, great information about fungi. As we get started, for your safety, we've included a few disclaimers. First off and foremost, this is not an identification talk. Mushrooms can be dangerous. If you're looking to identify them, you need to seek a professional source for that purpose. There's a number of great groups that you can join in order to learn more about mushroom identification. The closest one that we know of is the Cumberland Mycological Society. We have a link included for you. But again, this is not an identification course. In addition to that, we are not doctors. While some of the fungi discussed may be mentioned for their historical or experimental uses in medicine, you should never attempt their use without guidance from a licensed medical professional. And just as we get started, and as an important note, we cannot hope to cover the full width and breadth of this topic. It's huge. So what we're hoping to do today is to give you a good toolkit as a foundation for your fungi growing journey. Just to expand on that topic being huge note, a lot of people don't know how very prevalent in our day-to-day lives mycology is. Mycology is just the study of mushrooms. Mushrooms and fungi in general are used in a huge variety of industries, even beyond culinary and medical industries. They're used as pest control. They're used for building materials, as you can see in the upper left-hand corner in this picture. We've seen them inoculated into cutting boards and used as paper. They're also pretty frequently used, and especially were used as some of our earliest inks and dyes, as you can see on this color chart off to the right. Those are all natural colors from fungi. And as we get into cultivation, it's important to ask ourselves the right questions moving forward. What do fungi need to thrive? And one thing that you may notice about this list is that it's very similar to what we need to thrive. They need clean water, they need a healthy diet, appropriate nutrition, they need good clean air and oxygen, they need warmth, and they need an appropriate fruiting surface in order to reproduce.
We're going to touch back on asexual and sexual reproduction. You'll notice in these pictures to the right, up here in the top, we've got an agar plate with a white piece of mycelium on it. Underneath that, you've got liquid cultures. There's mycelium within that. Underneath it, you've got a spore syringe. This spore syringe was created and taken from a spore print. Notice that the spore print has two different colored backgrounds, so that if the spores happen to be the same color as the background, they would show up. Now, while you can buy spore syringes, you really want to try and avoid them because they typically do have contaminants on them from the environment. Further, liquid cultures are cheaper, faster, and scalable. Tissue cultures can be taken from store-bought or wild mushrooms. That's sort of what's happened on that agar plate. And if you decide to take that route, you want to break open and get into the center of that mushroom. Because if you try to collect that tissue from the outside, again, you're very likely to get a I do want to note that agar is very expensive, at least relatively speaking. It is also an advanced technique. It's much harder to do with the things that we're going to describe. If you're in a lab setting, it's a good way to go because they're actually easier to clean contaminants out of, and you're actually able to select for different rhizomorphs. You can think of rhizomorphs as whenever the mycelium's running, that leading little edge, that's what they're selecting for. And you could draw a pretty good analogy to hybridization of a plant. This slide could come after almost every single slide that we're going to show you today. While you might see up here in the top left corner, this person fully decked out in their Tyvek suit, face covering inside of a really nice laminar flow hood. You don't have to have that type of equipment. By all means, if you've got the thousands of dollars to buy that equipment with, and you want to see a 100% success rate with everything you're doing, you can spend that money. But you don't have to. You can substitute with something like a glove box right below it here, also known as a still air box. When you're working inside of that, you're going to want to make sure that all of your surfaces have been cleaned off with this 70% alcohol or some other disinfectant. I like the 70% alcohol because it's cheap and works very well. You're going to want to use that on your gloves that you're using or hands if you're cultivating without gloves, any surface that you're going to be touching, and even the inside of the box. You'll also notice this middle picture here with the lighters, candle, and this funky looking thing here. That's called the bacti-cinerator. You always want to flame sterilize the working end of whatever tools you're using. And to that point, you, as the cultivator, always need to shower beforehand. Make sure you're wearing clean clothes. You want to keep your hair up and out of the way. And yes, you do need to wear a face covering and avoid mouth breathing so that the contaminants coming from your mouth don't get onto the surfaces that you're trying to work on. Some of you may already see a potential hazard here. We're working in a glove box with still air, so there's not much air being exchanged. We're spraying a flammable alcohol inside of there, and we're using a flame to flame sterilize. You do have the ingredients to make a little bit of a boom or explosion, very small. So you want to be cognizant of that. Let your alcohol settle before you strike an open flame or anything to that effect. I can tell you from firsthand experience, it can be a little surprising. We mentioned liquid cultures, and as I promised, we will definitely go more in depth. One thing that's going to be true no matter whether you're working with these liquid cultures or any stage of the mushroom cultivation, you really, really, really need to label everything that you're doing. So here, as our example is written for lion's mane, and that Latin name being HE, you want to label it with HE, as well as the date, day, month, year. And if multiple people are working on some of these projects, you need to initial them. It's also a really good idea to keep lab notes if you're working with multiple techniques, strains, people, or if you ever plan on going commercial. Something that you'll want to keep an eye out for with your liquid cultures, you want to look for discoloration, anything cloudy or milky, that's going to be a contaminant. You want to try and avoid that as much as possible. It's a little bit difficult to see, but here in this picture, in the middle one labeled Oyster, September 25th, 15, there's a little white bar down at the bottom. That is a Teflon coated stir bar. These things usually run 50 cents to $1 a piece. Marbles will work, broken glass will work, a nail with the head cut off will work. basically you need something in there that's going to be able to disturb the mycelium, break it up, as well as help you create a vortex. So whenever you are stirring it, and I really wished I could show you this in person, so that you can draw fresh air exchange in through the air port and into the liquid culture. Once you have inoculated your liquid culture, you want to make sure and let this set for 24 to 72 hours. After that, you're going to be stirring these things daily. So as you can imagine, if you're working with a lot of liquid cultures, you want to come up with a way to stir that without having to shake it by hand. It can get very time consuming and annoying. I've actually just put a magnet on the end of a drill and put it underneath my jar, and that's worked really well. Some people will glue magnets to a computer fan and put them inside of a cigarette box so that they make their own stir plate. And of course, you could buy a stir plate. There are going to be some preparations and needs that you need to keep in mind for this. First, you're going to need to either purchase or create your own airport jar lid. So if you'll notice down here in the bottom right corner, that is an airport jar lid. You've got this little red piece in the middle, that's your injection port, and you've got this white puffy piece, that's polyfill, and that's your fresh air exchange port. So if you're making these yourself, you're going to drill a 3/16 hole for your air port and a 5/8 for your injection port. Also, I'm assuming that you're going to be using quart jars for this, and that I'm assuming that because this honey liquid culture recipe down here in the bottom left corner, it is 2 teaspoons of honey for 2 cups of dechlorinated water. So one, the chlorine in our water will destroy the mycelium, and if you can use well water, it's actually preferred over just dechlorinated tap water because it has nutrients in it. But that 2 cups, 2 teaspoons amount will fill your quart jar about half full. That's important because whenever you go to stir this, you do not want that liquid culture to get the bottom of your filter wet. There's also the need for sterilization in this process. So after you've gotten your airport jar lid made and your honey liquid put into the jar, you're going to want to put a piece of foil over the top of it, put that jar into a pressure cooker at 15 psi for 15 to 20 minutes, and then you'll want to let that cool overnight. One of the things that you're going to be using, as you can see in this kind of center picture here, is a 16 gauge lure lock needle. All the suppliers that we mention here later on will carry those. And I want to point out a really, really big no-no. So you see him spraying off the surface here. That's a good thing. I'm assuming that he's already flame sterilized and let his working tip cool before he's put it in here. However, his hands are on the filter. Oh, don't touch your filters. It's bad. Bear with me as this slide is a little long and we probably should have made it 2 slides. However, there are some things that are true for both of them, and that's why we chose to leave it on 1. No matter if you're working with sawdust or grain spawn, moisture content is key. If you've ever worked with or measured field capacity of soil or a planting medium, basically what you're going to want to do is have a handful of that you squeeze as tight as possible, and optimal moisture content is whenever you squeeze that, you don't have any water running out. Maybe you get 1 drip, maybe you get 2, but you don't want just water to sop out of your hand whenever you squeeze that substrate. The pH is also pretty important. I've personally never had to measure the pH of my substrates. Not saying that I couldn't improve my cultivation in that way, but typically it works out that it's usually around 5.5 to 6.5, which is pretty optimal for mushrooms. They can grow in as low as a 4 pH, and I believe up to a more alkaline 8, but we definitely want it to be on the acidic side. Gypsum is a common mineral supplement for both sawdust and grain spawn. There are tons of other options out there to put some micronutrients and or macronutrients for these fungi into your mediums. But I want to keep this simple, and if you decide that you want to explore, check out the resources, check out all the materials that we provide, because the amount seems endless. Specific to using grain spawn, you're going to want to pre-cook your grains so that you can destroy all the endospores that are inside of those grains. And in doing so, you want to make sure that these grains are not too hard, not too soft, and break up fairly easily. Now, because these grains are very likely to have some sort of microbial contaminant on them, it's important that we sterilize these. So that process is going to be pressure cooking, again at 15 psi, for about 60 to 75 minutes, and then letting it cool overnight. You'll notice down here in the bottom right, the colonization of these grain jars. Now, what I like to do whenever I have one like here on the left that's a little over 30%, I will actually take my jar and beat it against a phone book or something, a very forgiving surface. Obviously, we don't want to crack this glass, but that way it breaks up the grains, shakes them around, and redistributes the mycelium. So far as sawdust goes, it's typically used for fruiting, but sometimes can be used as spawn for your bioremediation or for your logs. And you're going to make this sawdust medium, you're going to inoculate it with either the grains or a liquid culture. Now, whenever you're using liquid cultures to inoculate either of these, you don't have to use a lot. Your syringe may be 60 cc's. You really only need 2 cc's to get something going. The more cc's of that liquid culture you put into it, the faster it's going to inoculate, but the more liquid culture that you are going to have to make or buy. For the sawdust, we actually don't have to sterilize it. In this case, we're going to pasteurize it. So all of that sawdust is going to be packed into a heat-resistant plastic bag and submerged into boiling water that is 140 to 170 degrees for 1 hour. Some of the various kinds of mushrooms that you'll come across need a different requirement to fruit them out of this sawdust bag. You'll notice that this yellow oyster here, what they've done is they've actually poked holes in the left and the right side of it. They've done that after it was nearly fully colonized. You don't want to do this too early, otherwise you're going to allow contaminants to get into your bag. Others, such as shiitake, they will prefer that the top of the bag just get cut open because they need more fresh air exchange. So consult what species you're growing to see if they need more fresh air exchange or if they need to maintain a higher humidity and water content within the mycelial block. Once you've made your grain spawn or sawdust spawn, you can then use that to inoculate a straw medium. Now, I'm going to say straw. I'm going to say straw again, and I'll just do it another time for emphasis. Straw, meaning not hay. So once you have your straw, you're going to want to chop this into 1 to 3 inch pieces. Now, you could get out there, put it on your cutting board, and get your chef's knife and chop, 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 chop. Or you could just pile up your straw and run it over and over and over again with a push lawnmower. I've seen some people that have the bag collection so that as they're mowing over it, it gets collected into a bag. I've seen others where they just kind of push it to one side, push it back to the other as it's ejected out of the port. After you've gotten it chopped up to that 1 to 3 inch size and increase the surface area for that mycelium to really take an aggressive hold of it, you're then going to want to pasteurize it. So pasteurization for this is that 140 to 170 degree water that it's going to be submerged in for 60 to 90 minutes. After that time has passed, you're going to want to pull it out with a strainer, or out of, if you've got it in a burlap bag, you're going to want to pull that burlap bag out and allow it to drip and cool for 1 to 2 hours. Again, you don't want to get rid of all of the water because the mushrooms need it, but you do want to leave some. When you go to pack this straw into your plastic bag that you'll be fruiting from, you're going to want to make sure that you don't leave any air gaps, because if the fungi finds an air gap inside of your bag, it will actually try to fruit inside of the bag, and that's not what you want because you can't harvest them that way. As you're packing it in, you want to intermittently add your inoculum or your spawn into it. And once the plastic bag is at least 80% colonized, then you can poke some holes in it for your mushrooms to fruit out of. There are a lot of supplements that you can put into this straw. However, I would encourage you not to do that while you're beginning, because it will increase your chances of contaminants. But once you get comfortable with all of these different processes, it will also increase your yields. This straw bag is typically used for oysters, but that said, fungi are really amazing, and many of them can be trained to fruit on different substrates than are normally used. But that takes a lot of work, and again, that's another advanced practice. So by now, you've heard me talk about sterilization, pasteurization, and you've heard me mention contaminants several times. It's obviously important that we try and keep these contaminants out. In this picture, you'll see the green down here in the bottom left corner. It's probably a trichoderma mold that actually will outcompete and feed off of this healthy white mycelium that you're actually trying to cultivate. But no matter what the color, green, black, yellow, etc., it's all bad. The species that we are talking about all have white mycelium, and those are the most commonly cultivated types of mushrooms. Another problem that some people have is that they will accidentally inoculate the same substrate with 2 different types of mushrooms. Sometimes this will just happen in the wild. For example, turkey tail mushroom. It's a very common competitor on your logs that you're trying to cultivate. You'll see why here in a chart a little bit later. This isn't good because these 2 different species, whenever they're trying to claim this food source, and as mentioned in the last slide, they are creating an exterior stomach so that they can then digest the things inside of that zone or that area. Well, where they end their quote-unquote exterior stomach and meet another type of mycelium, they will engage in something very similar to chemical warfare. They will begin releasing metabolites and other chemical compounds to fight one another. This is not something that we really want. However, some caveats are certainly out there. I know many of you have heard of morel mushrooms. I don't know anybody personally who can cultivate these within a lab or commercial setting. Some people claim that they can, and one of the biggest and most commonly accepted, or at least theorized, ways that they're doing this is because there are certain contaminants that this morel mushroom needs. Whether it's feeding off of that contaminant or if that contaminant's making the food source more available, it's not really clear. Vine caps, or garden striparia, garden giant, is another one that actually does pretty well with contaminants, but when you're trying to get your initial spawn or mycelial block developed, you still want to try and minimize those. But after this vine cap is out in the ecosystem, it has a very strong footing. It actually does better whenever it has these contaminants in its environment. That's why it does so well in the soil. I'm not going to insult you and read all these different things down here in this chart, but it does give you a really good idea for timing, and it also lets you know the importance of watering. I will let you know something that is not mentioned, at least in the type of detail that I like on this slide, is how you're actually going to get this mycelium in the ground. So the method that I like, I will dig out my bed in the soil and I will line that bed with cardboard so that I've got at least, again, a pretty good chance to give my garden striparia a head start. Once I've got that cardboard down, I'm going to fill it with wood chips and or straw. I'm going to thoroughly soak that area and water, again, with that dechlorinated water or well water due to its mineral content. And then I'm going to inoculate with my spawn. And I really like to get a pretty decent and somewhat continuous layer here. You know, if you've got one bag and you're trying to treat a 10 by 10 area, that'll be fine. They don't have to make a perfect layer. Once you've got your inoculum spawn down, you want to cover that with an additional 2 to 3 inches of wood chips. You know, note this chart for the timing, and again, I cannot place enough emphasis on keeping this bed watered. From our last talk, we also mentioned mycoremediation. This is important because certain strains, such as the garden giant, can break different compounds down. It's really important that if you are cultivating for mycoremediation purposes and you're trying to clean up something that is liquid or water soluble, you want to try and ensure as long of a contact time as possible with that contaminated liquid and your mycelial mats. So this is a growing field of study. Tradd Cotter, he actually developed a water purification system for Haiti whenever they had their earthquake several years ago. And one of the problems that they had was that once they made these kits and sent them out to people, some people tried to improve their kits by drilling more holes into it so they got quote unquote clean water faster. Well, it totally messed up the contact time that the mushrooms needed to break down those contaminants. Different mushrooms can target different compounds. Oyster mushrooms, I believe, have been shown in some cases to break down oil and even plastic. Peter McCoy has some great videos on, I believe it was an oyster mushroom as well, that's breaking down cigarette butts. This can be used to prepare sites or to clean up soil that's already polluted. However, you want to keep in mind, and a really great example is Chernobyl. There were some fungi that were the first things that we saw popping up around Chernobyl. Well, these mushrooms that were growing in that area were actually hyperaccumulating the radioactive materials within the soil. So they were pulling it out of the environment, which is helpful because it's cleaning it up. However, these mushrooms then were radioactive themselves and needed to be disposed of in a proper manner.
So now that we've covered the somewhat more complicated topic of liquid cultures, I'm going to discuss log inoculation. And this is a pretty great spot for beginners to look into fungi for. It's definitely a place where a lot of people start in terms of inoculation and growing their own fungi. And it's pretty simple, it's straightforward. You can definitely scale up. You can use your liquid cultures or other inoculants in order to inoculate your logs. Generally speaking, and what we're going to focus on, most people will use dowels in order to inoculate their logs. That's what you see in the picture up at the top there. And this is one that can be particularly useful if you've got children who are interested in learning about mushroom cultivation, or if you're just looking for a good project to pass the time but aren't looking to make a major science project out of it. Okay, and of course, if you're getting started with a project, you need the right tools. So you've got pretty much everything that you're going to need here in this picture. You obviously will need some good safety gear. You need your glasses because you will be drilling. You need some earplugs if you've got sensitive ears because it's going to be pretty noisy. It's a good idea to have a solid drill with, these are twist bits. They're used for wood up at the top left. Or there's actually an adapter for angle grinders that you can use, and a lot of people prefer it. It's a bit faster. And it actually will stop you at the correct depth for your dowels on your logs, where on your twist bits you'll actually need to add a little piece of tape to mark the depth. You will additionally need a mallet in order to tap in your dowels. You don't want to use a hammer. The hammers can actually break dowels and damage the bark of your logs. And you'll need this little block of red stuff over here is cheese wax. You can also use beeswax. I find that I prefer cheese wax because the melting point is lower. It doesn't have to be as hot. And the heat of beeswax can actually harm your mycelium. That's not likely, but it can. And you'll of course want to paint that on with an old brush or something that you don't mind getting wax on. Similarly, whatever container you heat up the wax in needs to be something that you don't mind getting wax on, because again, that's pretty hard to remove. I have used a crock pot to great effect, just an old crock pot. And other people will just microwave a little bit of it in an old Pyrex or something like that. You also want to take care when you're choosing the log that you're using. Fresh tree falls can be a really great source, although they are occasionally too old. You want to be careful about that. And you want to make sure that it's not too large and not too small. Whatever the log size is, it needs to be something that you can handle working with, because if you've got this great big old log and you're struggling and you're dropping it on your toe, it's going to be a little bit less fun than if you've got something that's a more manageable size. Generally speaking, 46 inches diameter is pretty common. 2 to 3 feet in length is also pretty common. And keep in mind as well, the larger the log is, the more fruit you'll get, so the more mushrooms that you'll get, but it will take it longer to colonize that log, and it won't fruit until it's fully colonized the log, so you'll have to wait longer for the fruit of your labors. With tree falls as well, you want to avoid transporting over distances. This can cause several problems. Mainly, we don't want to encourage the spread of diseases to our trees, and there's actually a number of legal restrictions on it in various counties. You may get fined. You want to damage the bark on your log as little as possible. It is the house for your fungi, and it helps keep out competitors. Using old logs can be a problem, as JD mentioned, because there are a ton of competitors that want to get in there and feed on that log as well as whatever you're trying to inoculate it with. And that includes turkey tail, Trametes versicolor. That's a very, very common competitor, and there's every chance that it's already colonized an old log by the time you pick it up. Once you've got your log, you want to let it cure, and basically that just means letting it spend 2 to 4 weeks in a cool, dark place. There's a couple of reasons to do this, but basically if you've got a space underneath your porch or in your basement, somewhere you can keep it covered in a tarp and fairly safe, then it should suffice. And once it's cured, it's time for inoculation. Here we have a really nice chart for the preferred types of wood for our various mushrooms. You can see that a lot of these do prefer hardwoods. There's not as many mushrooms that prefer softwoods, and softwoods tend to include our firs and our pines, a lot of the evergreen trees. Most of them prefer the hardwoods, and that's pretty frequently oak in our area. We've got a lot of mushrooms that really like oak. That will include shiitake, which is one of the ones we'll be mainly focused on for this talk. And there are a number of these charts available to you. Paul Stamets, Peter McCoy, and Trad Cotter all have really excellent, much more detailed charts in their books if you choose to look those up. This is just a very simple example just to give you an idea of what they tend to look like. And as I mentioned, shiitake is one we're focusing on. So basically, I thought that this would be good to do a little bit of a deeper dive on to give you an idea of what you're going to be looking for in terms of hunting the appropriate inoculant for your logs, and to provide you with an example that's fairly simple to start out with. Shiitake is a pretty forgiving one, and it is the second most widely cultivated mushroom in the world. I believe the other one is oyster. What's the other one?
The other one is the Agaricus bisporus.
Oh, okay. The other one is Agaricus bisporus, sorry, and that is your baby bells and your portobellos. So this is an excellent mushroom for beginners. It's very nutritious. It tastes wonderful, and it's pretty recognizable as well. And continuing on that, this will kind of help expand your vocabulary a little bit, which is going to be helpful if you're on mushroom forums, if you're reading the books and you're wondering, you know, what these different words might mean. It can be pretty helpful to know them just to keep from having to look things up every time when you're reading up on your project. With shiitake, you've got a light to dark brown cap, often including white speckles. They only grow on hardwood logs, so you automatically know that if there's a softwood log that looks like it's got shiitake on it, that's not shiitake. They grow in groups. With the exception of when you're growing on these logs, sometimes you can see down in that middle picture, there's single mushrooms coming out because there's just not much more room for them. And then they are gill fungi. So underneath the cap, you'll notice, and that's actually more evident in this picture over here, in the center, it has little gills coming out underneath. And it won't be smooth, it won't have little pores. You'll know that anything that has that appearance is not a shiitake. Additionally, shiitakes have a white spore print, and so this is why it's really good to have two-toned paper when you're doing spore prints. You wouldn't be able to see this on white paper. And we have our plug spawn. This is just a good visual for you. So obviously you've got your dowel here in the middle, and this is just an uninoculated dowel made of presumably whatever hardwood, in this case probably oak, that you'll be using for your mushrooms. On your left, you've got the inoculated and colonized plug spawn. And on the right, we've got it all packaged up for delivery from Everything Mushrooms, which is actually in Knoxville. So if y'all are interested in sourcing some local mushrooms, that's the place to go. They are absolutely fantastic. We have log inoculation as we get started here. You're looking at the drilling of the holes for your plug spawn. They should be flush with the outside of your log, not too deep and not sticking out. And this is to prevent issues with sealing once you're using your wax on them. A good 5/16 or 7/16 diameter bit is a good bet. You'll want to check with your spawn source because dowel sizes do sometimes vary. And you want to drill them approximately 3 inches apart in rows. This is basically to maximize the use of your space. There's debate on how many is enough and how many is too many, but generally speaking, this is accepted. And if you want a little more information on this part of the topic, you can also check out Penn State has a pretty fantastic shiitake grower school that can provide you some more information. And then once you've got your holes drilled, it's time to put in the spawn. So for this instance, we're talking about dowels. You're going to take and put them into the top of the holes. They won't slide right in. So that's why you've got your mallet. And again, no hammers, only mallets, rubber mallets. Just tap them gently into the holes until they're flush with the surface, and cover each inserted dowel with your cheese wax or your beeswax. If you receive your plug spawn and you're not planning to use them that day, do refrigerate them. They can usually keep from 6 to 12 months in this case, but sooner usage is definitely better.
Once you've gotten your logs inoculated, it's time to let them colonize. So you'll notice that one of our first bullet points is to keep them off the ground. This is true for most species. However, that asterisk means that some of them do like to be on the ground. Excuse me. No matter which type of mushroom you've used to inoculate with, you're going to want to keep these logs in a shady, cool, damp place and water when they're dry, just like anything else. The air exchange is very important, and you really want to avoid stacking different species. You'll see here in a little bit, we're going to talk about the different types, ways to stack them, and the species that like to be stacked a certain way. But I'll let you know that there's a little bit of a stacking and expanding hack. So once you've got a log that is fully colonized, you can actually start inserting fresh but cured logs that don't have any drills, don't have any dowels, don't have any wax on them. You can actually intermix those into your stacks, and that mycelium will spread from your colonized log to your uncolonized log. Now this will slow down your fruiting because the mushroom wants to claim as much territory as it can before it starts fruiting. So in this picture on the right, you actually see a beartooth fungus. It's related to the lion's mane mushroom. This one actually grows much more commonly in our area. But as you can see, they like to have this totem style. They actually grow out between the different the cracks there, as you can see. And these also like to have contact with the ground. Again, there's probably some bacteria or other microbe involved that they feed on or helps make nutrients available to them. We're not 100% sure on what the benefit is, what the mechanism is. The shiitakes that we're encouraging you to start with, though, like this log cabin style. This is really good. You want to get them close together while they're still inoculating, and then once they fully colonized, and how you'll know that they're fully colonized, you look on the outside of these logs right here, you'll see white mycelium colonizing that edge. Once they've colonized, you'll actually need to increase the space between the logs, because in this bottom left corner, say you've got a mushroom that fruits way down in this deep dark crack. How are you going to get to it? That's why you want to have this more open air log style cabin that's on the top right. Some people also choose to stack their logs in a teepee style for their shiitake cultivation. And I've even seen where some people will not stack them and just set them on end, leaning up against a tree or brick or something to that effect. I'm not a big fan of leaning them up against a tree, especially not an oak tree, because if that oak tree is at all unhealthy, when these shiitake spores or mycelium come in contact with it, they will try and colonize that tree. I did have firsthand experience of cultivating an oyster mushroom that hit I believe it was an elm tree. And 1 year to the day, I had a giant flush of oyster mushrooms, and in the next year, that same tree fell over. So keep that in mind, that you want that these will go after damaged, dying, or senescing trees. Now that we're getting into the fruiting section, it's important to know that there are 4 major categories to stimulate fruiting. The humidity is important, the temperature is important, the lighting is important, the air exchange is important. Those all matter, no matter if you're cultivating logs or if you're trying to grow on sawdust or grains. Now, I will make a quick mention that you can actually eat myceliated grains. So you can skip the fruiting process for things like growing lion's mane on quinoa. And it actually has more benefit for you in that way because its compounds are more concentrated in the mycelium than they are the fruiting body. With that in mind, you want to typically, no matter what, make sure the humidity's high. Mushrooms are more water than they are anything else. And in most cases, you want to increase the temperature. There are some cases, like with a pearl oyster, where they fruit at a colder temperature. The Phoenix oyster, which is more of a tropical oyster, it likes to have a really hot environment. The lighting, you never, while they're growing, want to put the mushrooms in direct full sun. You really want them to be in deep shade, indirect sunlight, and probably no more than 2 hours of indirect sunlight in a day. The air exchange is also important unless you're trying to grow something like a bonsai reishi. The bonsai reishi are actually favored because in Chinese traditional medicine, they like these really, really long, what they call antler pieces. And that CO2 is actually what forces them to get long and leggy, almost as though that they were starved for light if it was a plant. There are some tricks that you can do to force a flush. I typically wouldn't do this until after you've had your first flush, or if you can absolutely confirm that the log is fully colonized. The easiest and most common way is to soak them. Again, avoid that chlorinated water. Chlorine kills microbes. That's why we put it in our water. And using the well water or pond water is ideal because of the micronutrients that are available. Pond water is typically very high, or rainwater even is very high in nitrogen, and the mushrooms need that. Another thing that you can simulate is hitting them. So you've got a tree out in the woods, one of its branches is becoming colonized by some mycelium. That mycelium, being a saprophyte, is breaking down some of the lignin or the woody structure. And whenever that log finally breaks, it falls and flap, it hits the ground. That will stimulate fruiting. Well, you can do that with a rubber mallet as well. Now again, you want to avoid hitting that bark, but if you hit them on that side, that clean cut side, you can usually stimulate fruiting that way. Another one, and which is actually slightly more dangerous, but very much more efficient, you get much larger yields, is you can literally shock the logs. So tasers can work. Cattle prods actually show the best, but this is where we're trying to mimic a tree that has been colonized by a mushroom getting struck by lightning. So whenever that lightning strike happens, that lightning strike doesn't sit and stay on the tree. It is a high intensity burst for a very short amount of time. Don't get out there with your taser or cattle prod and just hold it to the wood. You're not doing it any good. You're at that point starting to kill the mycelium. You also, coming from, I guess, secondhand experience, one of my good friends, I told him about this and he walked out. He was ready to shock his logs. He was standing barefoot in wet, soggy ground. And, well, he got a little bit of a zap as he started shocking his logs. So you know, avoid standing in puddles of water while you're using these things. Don't do it in the rain. You know, if you've got a shoe that can absorb that, that's grounded, that's good too. Harvesting, you know, you've gotten to this point. Yay, congratulations, you get to harvest. You do not want to harvest these and immediately freeze them. Now you can harvest them, cook them, and then freeze them. That's a great way to do it. If you just have, you know, maybe some small handfuls of mushrooms that you can eat relatively quickly, you're going to want to put them in a brown paper bag or something that's breathable. And I would encourage you to put them in the refrigerator, but you can even leave them on a countertop or something to that effect. And certainly the best way to store mushrooms is by having them dried. I also want to take this time to mention that you can do a little bit of a vitamin D3 hack. So we've alluded to how similar fungi are to animals. Well, just like us, whenever we're outside in the sun, we are able to convert some of that sunlight into vitamin D3. Mushrooms do this exact same thing. So if you're able to, take your mushrooms outside in direct sunlight after you've harvested them, expose them gills up, and at that point, they will begin accumulating a massive amount of bioavailable D3. This is great to supplement for your winter times when you're not getting out there. It helps boost your immune system. I mean, the benefits of vitamin D3 are nearly endless. So you've gotten them harvested, and it's important to also let you know that you need to learn how to cook them. There's a lot of delicious looking food here, and that's going to be really important for us to be able to absorb them. So part of our modern diet, modern lifestyle, we've actually lost some of the enzymes and metabolites in our own system to break down a raw mushroom. Raw mushrooms have chitin in them. That's a structure that we have a really hard time breaking open and freeing up the nutrients within. Heat breaks down chitin and makes it where we can eat and absorb the nutrients within these mushrooms. If you've gotten this far, congratulations, and I hope that we haven't scared you. I just want to remind you that store-bought is fine. You can buy grow kits that have already been inoculated. You can buy the finished product. You could buy a log. You could buy anything that we've mentioned at any point of this. We just thought it was very important to show you from the liquid culture and maybe even agar plate stage all the way up through the different cultivation steps so that you can expand your own mycelium for pennies on the dollar. There are a lot of great suppliers out there. As we mentioned earlier, Everything Mushrooms is an ideal local resource. The fungi.com, that's Paul Stamets' website. They've got some great stuff. I really like their tinctures and other supplements. Mushroom Mountain, that's Trad Cotter's website. They're a great source for spawn. I believe he teaches an identification course that you can sign up for. It's really good stuff. Mycologos, that's Peter McCoy's website. It also, they have a lot of teaching resources there. Field and Forest, I believe, might be the oldest supplier in the nation. If not, North Spore's right there with them. Both of those are great companies that have been around for a very long time. And I want to mention again this extension article about Shiitake Grower School from Penn State. These are the online resources that we listed last time. They're no less important now than they were then. We couldn't give you every single detail that you need, so please consult these websites. The same goes for these books. It's very important for you to educate yourself and learn some of the things that we weren't able to teach you today.
And just kind of rounding it out, thank you all so much for coming to our talk. And you may or may not be familiar with champignons. It's a mushroom pretty frequently found in French cuisine. And I thought it was pretty interesting to find. I don't know if you have viewed the part 1 of this talk, you may remember that I mentioned that portobellos and baby button mushrooms are the same mushroom. They're both Agaricus bisporus. Champignons, which are typically served in high dollar restaurants, are also Agaricus bisporus. So in one fell swoop, you could serve all 3 at a dinner table.
Thank you all, and good luck. I hope you keep that mycelium running.
Thank you all.
We hope you enjoyed this presentation and that you learned something that will help you in your gardening endeavors, whether that means more blooms on your flowers and ornamental shrubs, attracting more pollinators to your garden, or improving your vegetable production. As we were not able to field your questions today, we want to close by offering you some ways to reach us. As you can see on this slide, we have a presence on Facebook. You may post questions to either of these Facebook pages. Feel free to upload a photo, especially if it helps to describe the problem you have. If you are not a Facebook user, you may call the Extension office at 865-215-2340 and leave a detailed message with your question. Your question will be forwarded to a master gardener to research and respond to you. You may also send an email to Ryland Thompson, the Knox County Extension agent who advises the local Master Gardener program. If a photo would help to describe the problem, feel free to attach 1 or 2. Try to keep the total attachments to less than 5 megabytes. You may get a response directly from Ryland, or he may route your question to a Master Gardener to research and respond to you. We are eager to return to public presentations. In the meantime, you can watch any of our recorded presentations by going to our website, finding a Speakers Bureau event on the calendar, and clicking on the link that is included within the event details. Now, let's go get some dirt under our fingernails.